fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn Blog and Dan with Julian Assele, who has now been a semi-regular guest, and today we are talking about the theorist of the sociologist come economic historian Emmanuel Wallerstein, and his particular version of world systems analysis or world systems theory. Now, a couple of caveats. I am what I would consider intermediately familiar with the works of Emmanuel Wallerstein. I have read World System Analysis and Introduction. I have read European Universalism and Rhetoric of Power. I have read one of the volumes of his, World Systems Mega History, which I consider kind of an expansion of the work of Brondel, who has a different intellectual background, which I think we're going to have to get into a little bit, because world systems theory is interesting. It has a interesting history in that it's tied into both Maoism in the West as well as longue durée economic history, which was not Marxist in the case of Brondel, as well as a crisis in analytic Marxism. All three things lead to Wallerstein. I was going through some 70s and 80s analytic Marxist works, and Wallerstein's part of the conversation. My friend Esri XB over at Swampside Chats has also written about this, or spoken about this, not written. But there's a pretty strong debate over whether or not world systems theory is still Marxist. There are debates over whether or not it's limited by things like methodological nationalism, which in the briefer works I've read, I think is a fair critique. But how did you get into Wallerstein, and why do you think, you recently went on a project to read the entirety of the world system, the modern world system history, which is, for people who don't realize, kind of a massive undertaking.
Oh God, yes. It was like, it's basically 4 volumes that cover from around 1350 to like 1914. And Wallerstein took basically a decade to write each book, which is only around like 250, 275 pages. But like, there were like pages in those books that are just like annotations. Like, I was taken aback by like the breadth of knowledge and scholarship that Wallerstein was basically tying into making these works.
Yeah, I mean, the first volume comes out in 1974. The second volume comes out a bit quickly in 1980, but then volume 3 doesn't come out to 1989. Volume 4, which is doesn't come out to like 2011. So yeah. And then after Occupy, he kind of had another work that was kind of hit, which I have read. Does Capitalism Have a Future? I have not read his last work, of which he was merely an editor, which is The World Out of Joint, the World Historical Interpretations of continuing polarizations, which I am interested in, but he was not a primary writer. But one thing I can tell you is I have not undergone the process of reading all of Wallerstein's world systems history. And I mean, he's an interesting figure in that he picks up what he adds to world systems theory. I think is interesting, right? So the world system for Wallerstein gets denotated as the capitalist world system, which I don't think Brundell and other people would have had a problem with, but that's definitely something coming out of his Marxist past in regards to working with people like Samir Amin or Terence Hopkins. And then you have core periphery theory and the concept of semi-periphery. Semi-periphery, I'm going to say, is a concept when applied in modern contexts, which was more done by Arrighi than Wallerstein. I don't believe. For example, or I don't believe it the way it's been commonly used, because world systems theorists today, and Wallerstein's admittedly died in 2019, so we can't accuse him of this, will say stuff like China is semi-periphery still, and I'm just like, bullshit. Like,
yeah,
I
wouldn't say that. Nah.
He talks about quasi-monopolies, which we can think of as monopsony monopolies, not true monopolies. And which was a kind of his out for the Sweezy problem, the Sweezy problem of monopoly capital, and whether or not that solved the contradictions of capitalism in the 1950s, which obviously didn't. And I think the other thing he uses, which is one of the things I take two things away from him that are kind of unique to him. Core periphery distinctions, I do think is useful. Semi-periphery, I think, is useful for what we call middle income nations and why the middle income trap exists. And then I think his use of Kondratiev raves is actually really helpful, even though for a long time I was not sure that I believed they were anything other than statistical noise. But I want you to go into to what you get out of world systems theory before I give like all my caveats. And so as a kind of overview, what did you get out of this deep dive into Wallerstein's work?
Right. So I think it's helpful to kind of go into like why I did this in the first place, and why I thought Wallerstein was somebody who was interesting to me enough to like dive into his massive kind of life's work. So I basically kind of found Wallerstein through Brodell, who is also somebody I'm very much interested in, who's like Civilization and Capitalism series I also want to get into.
I've actually read more of that than Wallerstein's work. I think Brodell is super important to my thinking. I also will point out Brodell, however, unlike Wallerstein, does not claim to be a Marxist. So,
no, yeah. But yeah, so I was kind of interested when I read, I think it was a review, some kind of book review that basically talked about how Wallerstein was one of kind of the lone voices in the 70s to say that the capitalist world system was kind of, well, not the capitalist world system, but American hegemony was like starting to decline. And he was
he says it 2 decades before Fareed Zakaria, which is 4 decades before anyone else.
Yes. And so like looking at that, I was like, wow, it's really interesting how he was able to kind of get to that conclusion. Like what was the methodology, what were the methodologies, and what was the journey that kind of led him there? And so that's what led me to reading these works, which what I kind of got out of, basically, if I can like put like a kind of, if I could sell a Marxist on like the Modern World System 4-volume books, I would basically call it like, if you were to take the part 1 of the German ideology, where Marx kind of goes into the history of like medieval Europe into the transition of capitalism, if you were to expand that 50, 75 page like section, into around 800 pages. That's what you get. And it is a really interesting history. It's a very strong history because one of the many themes Wallerstein emphasizes is that the core nations, as one would have it, so, whether it be the Northern Italy, the Dutch Republic, or like Northern Europe in general, usually are able to get to that point through like leveraging the process of uneven development through like peripheral regions, which is like a concept that if you are a Marxist, is definitely not an unfamiliar. It's not an unfamiliar concept, but the value of Wallerstein's history is that he's able to put a lot of flesh and bone to that. So, for instance, in the 16th and 17th centuries, he's like very much emphasizing the importance of the Baltic like wheat trade to Dutch and English hegemony. He's very much, and this is something I really think is great, and this is a misconception I had. He's very much into emphasizing like we cannot understand capital through like the lens of like the basic unit being the nation state. Like he can only understand it through the basic unit being like a system, meaning that like the core areas are not necessarily nation states, they're regions. The peripheral regions are not necessarily core states. Like these regions are constantly shifting around the system as it is expanding, and in relation to each other.
Right, which I think is crucial, because one of the things that even I used to have a misconception about Wallerstein when I would just read articles by him or about him, until I read his world systems analysis and introduction, where he goes into, yes, we end up having to be methodological nationalists in our data, but there is a sense in which our understanding of these trends are regional. These dynamics play within countries, and so a lot of the frustrations I have with Wallersteinians and world systems theorists now, it's actually not in Wallerstein. Wallerstein gets my problem. Like, he understands, for example, that the southeast of the United States was effectively a periphery or semi-periphery area during most of the 19th and 20th century. Right. And this is something that Wallersteinians often don't get. Like, they go back to missing the problem of, yes, you have to rely on national data, but that doesn't mean your analysis needs to be based on nations. And he's pretty clear about that in World Systems Analysis and Introduction. There's a whole paragraph where he actually directly addresses that criticism and explains, like, that's not good world systems theory. Like, to rely, to think of like the periphery as China, and not the periphery as areas within China, maybe like Henan and Wuhan, is a mistake in analysis. It's pretty fundamental from Wallerstein's perspective.
Oh yeah, and one of the other great things I love about Wallerstein is that he is able to anticipate future threads within Marxist political economy that at the time that he was writing, say in the 70s and 80s, were like just kind of things that Marxists weren't really talking about. So, for instance, Wallerstein in the first book, I believe, either the first or the second book, tackles the refutalization thesis, which is kind of the thesis that in the 16th century, Spain spread kind of feudalism into South America, the income.
Yeah, this is something that Banaji tries to debunk too.
I was about to mention Banaji. I was about to mention him. And Wallerstein is like, this is really dumb, because most Marxists writing today are not making the distinction between like modes of production and modes of exploitation. So just because you have a mode of exploitation that is, for example, slavery or I don't know how to pronounce this word, corvée labor, that does not
corvée labor, yeah.
Yeah, corvée labor. That does not mean that these modes of exploitation are outside of the rule of capital. Like,
Wait,
just
this is
because
the beginnings of the argument against people who argue that the Southern slave economy, for example, wasn't capitalist, which is something even Southern slavers would argue. But
yeah, so when I read that, I was like, oh shit, this is Banaji. This is just Banaji. Oh my gosh. Like, so this is something that got me very much hyped, because at the time Wallerstein was writing this stuff, like, he was kind of a lone voice, and he addresses this in the preface to the first couple of his books, where, like, the fiercest critics of his works weren't actually like neoconservatives or mainstream historians. Like, a lot of them are Marxists.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest, to be fair, one of the biggest critiques of him is that he came out of analytic Marxism and wasn't a proper dialectical thinker. That was the big one, which I've always just like, one, I'm not sure that he isn't a dialectical thinker, in the sense that a lot of what he does depends on systems theory. And I have actually been an advocate for saying that the development of modern systems theory has a direct route to historical dialectical reasoning.
Oh, billion%. Like, his whole, all of his books are about change in relation to changing elements and elements within elements.
Right. So I've always thought, well, that critique of him is, well, frankly, just unfair. But the other thing is, the reason why, though, it's easy to make with him, and I think it is hard for people who maybe don't know the history here, like the scholarly history here, to understand that part of why this is being made is because he was associated with what we call analytic Marxism now, which is like G.A. Cohen, Eric Olin Wright. He is not associated with them anymore. You know, he's associated more with Brundtland and other key thinkers, some of whom are not Marxist, but of world systems theory and of historical systems thinking. And you know, you can kind of think of this, the way I think of this is, what he's trying to do is he looks at the modes and relations of production, and also looks at like classical Stalinist modes of production logic with unilateral, just like, this is a mode, it's a concrete mode, move on. It's a discrete structure. There was a revolution, therefore it happened. And you know, anyone who's ever studied the Middle Ages realizes quickly, whether or not you're doing this from Hegelian lines or from Althusserian structuralist lines, it really doesn't kind of make sense. Like, you end up hitting like, well, why the fuck did it take 500 years for feudalism to like become a coherent thing that we could talk about? Like, why is there no one singular legal or economic system within it? And this led to all kinds of debates, like Semiramis' tributary mode of production and this, that, and the other. But Wallerstein, you know, really does try to answer this problem by saying, look, we can use this systems theory as kind of a historiographic rubric, and then we just go back and do real history, and we can see there's something to these modes of production and modes of exploitation, which is something that he kind of brings in as another category. There's something to like relations of production and the complicated interrelationship between legality and economics, and so it is not that these stages are completely false, but they're not discrete and just like, bam, there's one mode of production, and bam, there's another mode of production, and never the twain shall meet. And what's interesting about Banaji is Banaji actually trying to deal with the same problem, like in the 70s. And also Robert Brenner and the Brennerite school of political Marxism, which is a confusing name because it's not referring to politics, is also doing this by trying to explore the relationship of law in relations of production, and also coming out of a crisis of analytic Marxism. But then, of course, the Hegelian Marxist and also the structuralist Marxist too, even though they hate each other, both finger wag at that.
No, yeah,
like,
I mean, like,
so that's kind of the Marxist reception context. But I think there's also a whole other context but that's why he's like when I read I have to admit, when I read the World Systems Analysis and Introduction, I was like, it's like someone has been throwing the kind of complaints that I'm throwing at him by only have read a couple of articles 100 times, and he knows what I'm going to ask.
Well, like midway through, I think the second or third volume, I kind of realized that Wallerstein is kind of like Marx in the sense that everybody who critiques Wallerstein, or most people who critique Wallerstein, do so on the assumption that everybody has done the reading on Wallerstein, so they don't have to do the reading themselves. They can just read like secondary literature, kind of like critics of like Marx. And so most people just have Wallerstein just like completely incorrect, or if not incorrect, then like very much distorted.
Yeah, I mean, I will totally own up to until I sat down and read World System Theory and Introduction, which literally took I was like, oh, he just answered my question that I was going to critique him with. He admits the problems of methodological nationalism. Well, shit. And so I began to do is say, look, I don't have a problem with Wallerstein. Yeah. I have a problem with the way a lot of people use him, because he gets used and abused by everyone from third worldists to even some neoliberals. That the latter is rare, but it does happen. And so I started focusing on misuses of world systems theory and like focusing on, hey, like do what Wallerstein actually says and apply it within a country too, and then it'll start making sense. Like you start to see how this is useful.
I mean, this is another thing I found super useful about Wallerstein and his insistence upon like not using the nation state as like the basic model of like the basic unit of analysis, but the system as a whole is like for the past 3 months, I've been conducting a lot of studies on the role of Black America and American political economy. And a very big part of that is the domestic colony thesis, which was very popular, especially in the 60s and 70s. Everybody from like, Malcolm X, even like Martin Luther King Jr., we're talking about it. For like your audience's benefit, the domestic colony thesis is the idea that Black America is a colony within the United States. And like the economic structure, the political and economic structure that constitutes the relationship of a metropole to a colony is the same one that defines that between the United States and Black America. And this was kind of the theoretical basis for the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, especially like Vietnam going on, and even like with Black capitalism, what's his name, Cedric Robinson, and even now with like Black Lives Matter, and super helpful. Wallerstein's kind of conception of periphery and core, especially when applying it into the United States and with these now deindustrialized suburbs and like some of these inner cities, which are mostly like either majority Black or people of color or like white ethnic, that used to be these like incredibly prosperous, or like not incredibly, but like fairly like prosperous areas of the economy where like mill towns were, like manufacturing sectors that have now moved on. And so now we have these like really large deindustrialized suburbs and exurbs that are mostly like, they're not productive, but they are nevertheless like sites of just like hyper exploitation and hyper profits. Like if you go into a ghetto, you see not just like liquor stores, like everybody knows about the liquor stores, but like rent to own places, errands, incredibly usurious kind of furniture stores, that sort of thing.
The high cost of poverty discussion really is related to this, and I would say it at this point it's not just Black America, it's all poor America, but it always starts in Black America first. Like when you look at the patterns of shitty lumpenization of the poor. And this is something that one of the few things I will give Eldridge Cleaver credit for is realizing that because he's my least favorite Panther, but is realizing that whatever happened to Black America in its particular forms of lumpenization was going to happen to the entirety of most of the lower to lower middle stratum of the working class across the board.
Like, this is what happens with a lot of empires, where like what do they call it? Foucault's boomerang, where like what happens in the colonies eventually comes back to the metropole to be tried out on like the citizens of the metropole, in the similar sense that like all of the worst stuff that usually happens in America and like the working classes, it usually first starts with Black America. And the question is like, why does it usually happen in Black America? And one of the answers I have found the most compelling so far is that Black America constitutes something like an internal colony in the United States. But like one can only understand this, or like this only kind of makes sense when one has a model akin to Wallerstein's like world systems like analysis.
Right. Well, because what you're actually seeing, I mean, is it's not the internal colony makes it seem like it is purely colonial. That's not actually how it works.
Yeah.
It is a internal periphery that starts with Black America, but also expands mostly to almost all the poorer classes of the South. And then what you see is those conditions, even though conditions were better in the North. I mean, I often do point out, like, during the 1950 Social Compact, because of unionization, the average Black worker in Chicago actually did better than the average white worker in Atlanta. All right. But the white worker in Atlanta did way the fuck better than the average Black worker in Atlanta. But the conditions, because of the nature of racialization, because of the nature of redlining, because of the nature of specific qualifications for parts of the New Deal Great Society movement that was kind of foisting this all up, even in the Black ghetto in Chicago, even though those working class men had the benefits of unionization, they got exploited heavily on the consumer end by things like kitchenette hyper rents. Like, so because you were redlined in such a small part of the city, not only were you living in shitty housing, but it was actually on average more expensive than aggregate housing elsewhere. And you also, because of this, see the beginnings of the proliferations of usurious loans, and then also a lot of lumpen relations. Like, so you see the growth of gangs and urban crime. I mean, like, and if you stop thinking about it as a direct colony, because if you think about it as a colony, well, it doesn't make sense that it was able to be moved from the Southeast, where it affected pretty much everybody except for the very rich and kind of the carpetbaggers and planter class survivalists who become the elites in the South in the early 20th century. The reason why it was able to be moved is because it was also the periphery was moving, and they could legally, through all these legal shenanigans, kind of claw back parts of the New Deal for this particular group, and it was legally done. I mean, like,
yeah, like the exclusion of like domestic workers and agricultural workers in the Wagner Act, which were mostly Black professions.
So all this stuff is something that Wallerstein gives you a way to analysis and say, oh, this is how the internal colony stuff makes sense. This is the rational core of that, without being stuck in like, well, how do you have a colony that's not territorially delimited?
Exactly.
And also will sometimes affect white people in the same polity and sometimes not,
Right. It's the process of uneven development that capitalism like leverages to like facilitate surplus value extraction.
Exactly. That's a great, that's a key point to all this. And Wallerstein doesn't just solve this problem for the United States. He solves it for Europe, which explains the development of capitalism. Now, you do get into specific debates, like did capitalism start in the Italian city-states or in England? And I think I've always thought that debate was a debate over what you think the most important matrix is, whether or not you can have a fully capitalist society or not. Because if you believe capitalism doesn't start till you have fully instantiated capitalism, then Robert Brenner's right. It starts in England. If you believe that if you have 3 out of 4 things, you know, then it starts in the Italian city-states. I tend to cut the difference and talk about the Italian city-states as proto-capitalist or semi-capitalist, because there are some things that I think are missing. And I think if you don't do that, you end up with the problem you see in Benaggi now, where like he has elements of commercial capital going all the way back into the Roman Empire. And then I'm like, that sort of does. I don't think Wallerstein would have gone that way.
Right. I mean, I would say like where I kind of lean is probably the second camp, mostly because I do find the thesis that capitalism mostly has existed for a very, very, very long time. And what we talk about capitalism, we talk about like the eminence of it over society, which didn't begin until like, 16th, 15th century.
No, I think Brundall is the person. And I actually read I was reading a Rodney Stark, so conservative sociologist piece that pointed out that Brundall is the person who pointed out that there were capitalist relations and like 11th century monasteries, but they could never really spread, particularly during plague times, because the feudal rent system broke down.
Right.
But it could never spread to all of society till after the Protestant Reformation, and weirdly, Rodney Stark was using this to argue that Catholics invented capitalism, and that's a good thing. Wallerstein
also has some really interesting points about Catholicism in his like first book, weirdly enough, where he kind of argues that because one of the people he's kind of responding to is Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic thesis. And one of the things that Wallerstein, one of the points he brings up is talking about like why did Catholicism win out in Poland in like the 16th, 17th century? And what he kind of talks about basically is like I don't want to butcher this because it's a really elegant explanation, but it's kind of complicated. So for Wallerstein, one of the key characteristics of a peripheral state is if its national bourgeoisie is like kind of weak. Like for example, in Poland and in the Baltic states generally during the 16th, 17th centuries, it was like fairly weak because you had international bourgeoisie who had complete control over the wheat trade, and you kind of. I'm not gonna go into that because I'm gonna say something incorrect. But one of the points he brings up basically is like one of the reasons for why the Catholic Church won out in the peripheral regions of the world, for example, Italy, Poland, like those places, so to speak, is because the Catholic Church was. Damn it! I forgot what. Damn it! You know what? I actually have a better point to make here. I'll
let you make your better point. Let's go.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I just don't want to say anything incorrect here that Wallerstein can say much better than me. So one of the interesting points that he makes during the religious wars is basically like, for example, in the Netherlands, religion was kind of the language of nationalism before nationalism was a thing. And like the bourgeoisie, for Max Weber, the most like Protestant countries the most productive countries became Protestant. Hence with like Calvinism and all that. Like Calvinism helped make people productive because of the work ethic, all that stuff. For Wallerstein, it was the other way around, wherein like countries that were already productive became Calvinist. Because, for instance, in the Netherlands, when they were having their kind of religious wars or wars of succession with Spain, you had like many strata of the national bourgeoisie adopt Calvinism as a means of like uniting like different strata of Dutch society against the Spanish, who were closely aligned with the Catholic Church. And this was kind of a pattern you saw in places like France and Poland, etc. So I thought it was very fascinating how like Wallerstein was able to connect the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries with like nationalism. And in the background of that, like these very significant changes in economic development with like capital, the changing peripheries and cores in like in like Europe in general. So that's a really cool like thread and theme you find in the first couple books of his series.
Yeah, I think that's to me, and I will say I haven't read this series, but I have read his stuff on other shorter form stuff in the transition from let's say medieval, quasi-futural, minorial, all these historiographic terms were debated. That's why I threw them all out.
Right.
The one thing I will tell you is even Marxist historians, if they're not Soviets, don't really believe in a clean feudal mode of production. Even people who argue that the feudal mode is still coherent, people who I agree with, like Chris Wickham, will caveat it as it's not a clean unitary mode. It's actually like a very long transitional mode immediately turning into a very long other transitional mode.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is like the manorial system really does define it, but there's other things. And then there's like legal vestiges of the Roman Empire that last well into the 11th century. And then, like serfdom doesn't totally go away in either Russia or Sicily till almost the 20th, at least the 19th century. I mean, like, and the ancien regime elites are not fully inculcated into the bourgeois system until World War I and World War II. Like, that's a point made by Arno Mayer. It's a point made by Endnote, and it's one I think also that Wallerstein wouldn't object to.
Yeah,
although he doesn't go that far, and he doesn't write that far into the system, so we don't get that.
Right. I mean, one of the points Wallerstein makes is like he kind of doesn't believe the French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, because his argument is like at that point, like the noblemen were basically just capitalist farmers, like most of them, which I found to be pretty interesting. And like if you're able to read his books, like that, his third book is very fascinating on that.
So I've read How Revolutionary the Bourgeois Revolution by Neil Davison, and I actually do think Davison kind of wins that debate. But
really?
Yeah, but Wallerstein's reasoning I think is actually interesting. Because part of what's at stake is not the facts, it's whether or not what you think. What do you think the point of a bourgeois revolution was?
Right.
So and what I do have to admit though, Neil Davison has some problems that I have issues with, because while he's not a old school Sovietist or anything, I think he's some kind of Trotskyist actually, or was. I think he's still alive. He was really debating with Brenner, but also like taking shots at Wallerstein too. But I think some of his points about what the purpose of a political revolution is versus the development of a mode of production is actually kind of important.
Right.
But let's go back into what Wallerstein's argument is. So Wallerstein says that the French Revolution wasn't truly speaking a bourgeois revolution, unlike maybe say the English Civil War, which you probably would see as a bourgeois revolution.
Well, he also says it's a little bit complicated. I don't remember quite what he says with respect to the English Civil War, but I do know that he doesn't see it quite as like, oh, the bourgeoisie struck against the noblemen, because he also kind of has that analysis going where like, well, you know, the noblemen were also like kind of becoming capitalist farmers, but also they weren't quite there because a lot of their rents were kind of feudal rents. Again, like it's very complicated.
Right. Well, so what I think is true is there's not a singular moment of clean transition.
Yeah.
That the transition's actually quite long, and that's why which is why I think there's 3 French revolutions, not 1.
Right.
So
yeah, for Wallerstein, for the significance of the French Revolution for him is essentially that like the ideology finally catches up with like, if we're going to be, if you'll allow me to be vulgar here for a second, the ideology finally catches up with the base, so to speak. So like,
the justification in the base actually starts to make sense.
Yeah, like because a lot of the people he was sort of responding to, which were a lot of schools, it was a very long chapter in that 3rd book, essentially sort of believe that the French Revolution was when France became capitalist. And Wallerstein is like, well, no, it's been like that for a while. Even the noblemen, the nobility that did not like the French Revolution we're like capitalist farmers. But at the same time, like the French Revolution is an important watershed moment for 2 reasons. The first being that like it was when the quote superstructure caught up with the base, you know, being vulgar here. And secondly, he calls it the first anti-systemic revolt in the world system of capital. So up to this point in the development of capitalism, like there has been resistance, there has been class struggle, but for the most part, it's been very much localized, not very coordinated, like very like spurts in the wind. And for Wallerstein, the French Revolution, which kind of later goes into like the revolutions of 1848, was like kind of the first rumblings of like what he calls the anti-systemic movement against the system, which I think is pretty interesting. I think
it kind of emerges like. What's interesting about that is it kind of confirms the insight that Marx has that socialism as the answer to the problems of the Bourgeois Revolution emerge almost concurrently with capitalism. Like it's boom, boom, like that.
It's so fascinating, and I think he actually wrote a book, I think, with Arrighi on this particular subject, and I think he has this understanding of like 1968 as being the first anti-systemic revolt on a world scale, which I think is interesting because I myself don't actually know too much about 1968. Hence, right now, why I'm reading Mike Davis's new book on the LA in the 60s.
Yeah, I would say that is true, but with the caveat that I think labeling it anti-systemic is actually probably smarter than labeling it anti-capitalist exactly.
Yeah.
Because there are so many different ideologies going on in 68, and some of them are also internal to the Soviet bloc and China, which are then like in the Chinese one, it becomes part of the Maoist apparatus. Even is this revolt against the bureaucracy in China itself after the Great Leap Forward becomes part of, you know, the understanding of Cultural Revolution, which is a category that you get from Stalin. Actually, people don't know this, but it's part of Stalin's transition in the 30s. But that Mao goes way further with it than the Soviets ever did. But that it's also concurring when you're having these, what end up being, I would say bourgeois gentleman agreements in the developing world, but what really start off as revolts against the core.
Right.
And so the reason what I find interesting about that is I actually do take the people, the critics of third worldism, who point out, yeah, but all these are resolved by gentlemen's agreements between the developing world elite and basically the British Empire or the Americans or the French, with the exception of Vietnam, which is an out and out, it is both a anti-colonial war and a civil war.
Right.
Most of these wars are not, I mean, most of these, decolonization movements are actually relatively bloodless, which is interesting. But that is why 68 feels so important, even though in the cores it utterly fails. You have in France, you have the recapitulation of the French socialists and the French communists to the state.
In America, you have the counter-revolution.
Yeah, which was always kind of in there. And also, both the counter-revolution, we can talk about the late 20th century as a long counter-revolution, right?
Yeah.
But also the recapitulation of the New Left from a political movement into its association with the hippies into a cultural movement.
Yeah.
With it, even though there was a large anti-revisionist left in the United States, divided up amongst, I think, something like 70 sectarian groups or something, and if they'd have been unified, it would have been like 1 million people. It still was ultimately eclipsed by a double whammy, because what you also had is the profitability crisis of capital seeming to take the steam out of that.
Yeah.
This is the stuff where, our criticisms together with Christopher Lasch, where I think Christopher Lasch is absolutely correct about how this went down in America. But he was also writing about, look at all these other revolutions and how, he didn't call them bourgeois revolutions, but, he was talking about them as national liberation revolutions. And yeah, you do see a fundamental transformation of the world system, but what that fundamental transformation actually ends up being, and I point this out from people, is the end of Keynesianism, Marxist hybridism in Europe, or Fordist welfare statism, or Fordist quasi-welfare statism in America, into neoliberalism is what ultimately happens from this anti-systemic movement.
Yeah, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, whom I'm a big fan of. I don't know if you've read her stuff like Golden Gulag. I think she articulates that point very well, where she says the 60s and 70s marked the transition from a welfare warfare state to a workfare warfare state, which I think is a very apt kind of descriptor of this kind of stuff. What I think is really interesting about kind of transitioning from here, with like Wallerstein, is his thesis that like the 20th century, and like what you earlier said, the 20th century being the long counter-revolution, is kind of a signal that like not just American hegemony is in decline, because that's one of the claims he makes, but that like the capitalist world system is like in decline.
Yes.
And this is something that's very much in line with Marxist thinking, which I don't know if any of your readers have ever read like that red book, the Marx Engels Reader. But there's
I have it back here somewhere.
Yep. There's a very short passage in there where Marx basically says in an obscure letter, where he says, the goal of the bourgeoisie is to establish the world market. And there's a kind of sense of just kind of dread of like, we need to like make sure they don't do that. But like if they do, like I don't know how capital can like continue, because it will just continue. It will continue to become more dysfunctional, as we all know, because capital requires expansion and uneven development, and it can make up for a lack of extensive expansion through intensivity. But as we can see through the economies of the core, like things are becoming more dysfunctional as money, like as capital is on like a capital strike, as money has been diverted from like the actual like real commodity sectors of the economy to like more and more speculative enterprises. So knowing like
Wallerstein sounds like fucking Henrik Grossman.
Yeah,
like,
isn't that something? Like, yeah.
And what I find fascinating about this, for people who think the problem with centrism like the failure of centrism is the failure of like the last 10 years. What Wallerstein would be arguing is centrism has been failing into various forms of what I would say Bonapartism. He would not use this language, but I would say and I get this partly from Spencer Leonard, but I would say that the dominant mode of dealing with the crisis after 1914 has been various different forms of Bonapartist governments, and which is like these highly centralized states that do different things. But even the quote deregulatory crazy state of neoliberalism is actually highly state involved. Absolutely. Because the state now has to create and maintain a bunch of markets and things that it doesn't even make sense to marketize, and try to extract rents without engineering inflation, which is why you have this increasing monetary apparatus and this, that, and the other.
A sign of the dysfunction, I would argue, is like in the 80s, and Melinda Cooper, which I talked to you about before in her book, Family Values. Like the sign of the dysfunction is with like the Reagan administration, where they basically were like, okay, one of the ways in which we're going to save the economy is by basically shifting welfare from the burden being on the state, like social insurance, to being on individual families. So like basically getting the entire middle class to invest in 401ks, stocks, mutual funds, like basically financialized forms of social insurance that the state would have previously had like taken onto its back. Basically capital not capital, but like certain factions of the capitalist class in control of the state at the time, basically going, we're going to get everybody in on this giant Ponzi scam. We need everybody's money. We have to like circulate capital as quickly as possible through these like speculative, like market oriented like schemes. And many people would see the 80s as like the triumph of capitalism, but for Wallerstein, I would argue he would look at it as like capital trying to buy time.
Well, that's actually what he's interesting. Even someone as different from Wallerstein as Andrew Kleinman would see that. Well, I think what Kleinman would say is like basically crisis makes capitalism an eternal pump, which I think is weird and incorrect. But that the fiscalization was a big modal change, not just in the way we handled real commodities and money, but also in the increasing importance of rent and forcing things into private markets where there weren't any before, and creating systems that they were selling for market competition and efficiency, but were actually inherently and even on paper inevitably inefficient.
Right.
Because for one thing, it requires more and more middlemen. It's just that in and of itself should tell you that you have to provide for more circuits of social reproduction for things that produce less and less, and actually more and more of the economy becomes dependent on the surplus. Right. Which is something that a lot of vulgar Marxists on Twitter don't seem to fucking understand. So this is, and Wallerstein spells this out in a long narrative, and I think the advantage to Wallerstein over some of the other things that we've talked about is with the exception of Kondratiev himself, actually, and what makes Kondratiev so fascinating is basically world systems theory, Cleodynamics, and Kondratiev waves are the only attempts to to tie in profitability crisis, technological development, and legal and likely legal outcomes. And so none of this is also hard to determine, like, say, Althusserian structuralism is a little bit like there are contingencies here and they matter. But it's not like an Althusserian structuralism where it's like everything's structural and the only reason there's change is aleatory materialism. It's not like that. There are decision points and things change based off these decision points, and the decision points within key parts of the world system as the periphery moves around and as the core moves around, et cetera, and so forth. And the core's moved several times. I mean, like, the core has effectively moved from Britain to France, from France back to Britain, from Britain to the United States, and now it's kind of split between the United States, the Eurozone, and China, in a increasingly multipolar way.
No, yeah, like
they're all still part of the same system, though. And when people are like multipolarity, I'm like, but that doesn't do shit about capitalism. Capitalism can still collapse, motherfucker, and all these poles collapse with it.
Oh yeah. This is actually a pretty interesting point that Wallerstein brings up, where he says that having a hegemon is a exceptional point in the history of a world system, in the sense that, like, he pinpoints only 3 points at which there was like a clear hegemon over the entire system. That was the Dutch Republic, England, and the United States.
And so he puts the Dutch Republic and not France. Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, and the big point that he brings up is, like, but the thing about being a hegemon is that, like, the moment that they get to that point where they're at that high point, that's the moment where the decline, like, starts.
Right. Hegemonies decline immediately. So like I've always pointed it out, and I kind of do it shamingly, but I want people to think about it. The United States has the post-war social compact, from 1945 to 1961. That's it. That's absolutely it. And it starts declining by the late 50s.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy to think about, like, 1968 as, like, because as wealthy as the United States was relative to the world. Now, not on wall GDP, that's the 90s, but which, again, is probably why the 90s is where this is the moment of ultimate accelerations, because the moment where the United States is the true hegemon, right? The complete hegemon. There is no longer any competing anything. But U.S. hegemony is more or less established by the end of World War II. And it happens basically because of a freak accident that we just don't get bombed. Like,
and one of the ways in which that, and this is something that, this is not like a direct point that Wallerstein brings out, but this is something that's borne out by his logic, that hegemony is inherently, like, self-defeating because of the contradictions of capital, is, like, in the post-war compact with Europe, where America had this giant field of investment, so invested a bunch of money into the rebuilding of Europe, and basically allowed Europe to invade America with its goods because of how strong the dollar was.
Right.
And basically the and America could afford to do this because its manufacturing capacity was such that, like, Europe wasn't really that big of a competitor in, like, the early 50s. But once Europe basically, like, built itself up in the 60s, like, especially, like, going into the late 60s, that's when crisis starts to brew, because that's when America starts, like, getting flooded with commodities, especially from Germany and Japan. So yeah, that's one of the examples in which, like, hegemony is self-defeating, especially in the example of America, because one could argue, well, America didn't have to invest all that money in Europe, but on the other hand, like, America needed markets, and America,
if it needed markets, and it needed to get rid of surplus production, and the best way to do it without blowing shit up, particularly in light of a nuclear bomb, was to build out a trade infrastructure. By the way, which is pretty much what China was doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. They were just trying to do it less militaristically.
Oh yeah. And this is where, and this is where kind of China comes in, like the 70s, because as like America had this much competition in like manufacturing, Xi Jinping started like conducting his open door policy, like these open export zone. What do you call it? Export zone EZPs. Is that what they're called? Yeah. Like basically these zones in China and like these cities where China was like, hey, we have a lot of cheap labor. Manufacturing, come on in. Come on, set your factories down here. And so that's when like China was able to kind of climb up in like dialectical relation to America's relational kind of decline. And in that decline, America was able to kind of ease the pains of the working class by being able to offer much cheaper commodities due to how much less labor was going into those commodities because of China and manufacturing and automation. So
right, but China's attempt to not be semi-periphery or not get cut, or in normal economic speak, not get caught in a middle income trap,
right,
complicated this in the last 10 years. But it was also the only thing that in QE, or the only thing that got us out of the housing crisis recession, which would have been there's almost no way to keep the banks functional without that. So which means we should worry about the fact that China's having its own housing problem right now. Where people don't know, there are mortgage strikes. It's not just Evergrande. So this is why Marxists who have glommed on to the simplistic multipolarity thesis, which, by the way, even before Alexander Dugin looked at it, but it was resuscitated briefly at the end of the Bush administration by Fareed Zakaria, of all people, a globalist neoliberal. But he actually wrote the book, The Decline of America in the Multipolar World, in like 2007, which is part of what Dugin is responding to, actually, when he incorporates it into his research, and then goes back and looks at English political economy at the turn of the century, English geopolitical economy at the turn of the century, turn of 20th century, which is where a lot of his theories come from. I have always just pointed out, I'm like, well, if you think a multipolar world solves either the brutality of capitalism or the brutality of the American empire, you don't really understand what it means. Because the returning to a non-hegemonic status it doesn't undo anything. It's not that there are people who mistake me for saying that the American hegemonic period was humane or good, and I can literally, like, I agree with Ben Norton and Aaron Mate. I'll just look at the war totals and how many people died for stupid shit. And even just Americans, not even like, but definitely when you look at peoples of other countries, and then the knock-on effects from that, it becomes very clear that no, I mean, the American hegemony was not nice. It was not peaceful. This was not the Steven Pinker land. But there's no reason to assume that multipolarity is going to be any better in a declining capitalist system. In fact, there's reason to assume that everything that you're seeing now will continue to go the way that it is going.
Things becoming more chaotic and more scary, but with the addition of nuclear weapons.
Like that. So I'm always just like when we think about this, we should be very, very careful. And what we posit, the alternative that seems to be emerging organically and inevitably to be, because I see no way in which general profitability can fix this. And what I have seen, however, in lieu of it, is both neoclassical economics and heterodox economists pretending that this is not a problem.
I cannot say where things are going to go. I do not know.
Me neither, but I can just say that they're probably not going to be fun.
Yeah, I mean, the upshot of this is Wallerstein actually. I think one of the last interviews he did, he basically told this interviewer, he was like, yeah, like what we're seeing is like the decline of the capitalist kind of world system. Things are going to get more chaotic, but on the bright side, like because of like how much less sturdy things are, there is paradoxically like more room for action, because sort of like in a savanna that's incredibly dry, any spark that kind of lands on a blade of grass has the potential to cause like a firestorm, for better or for worse. Like not just for like revolutions or like, you know, workers movements that are like good and help people, but also by the same token like incidents that could cause like general wars or suffering.
Well, what I see is like the last crisis of the world system, which was the end of Trump, which is what he sees as the end of liberal centrism out of Europe, is that it can oscillate wildly in many directions, and that's what I think we have seen. And unfortunately, there's a lot of path-dependent reasons that lead people to be stuck in old ways or modalities of thinking. Like Marx talks about this. Marx doesn't use the language path dependency. That's me pulling from systems theory, but general systems theory, not world systems theory, although they are related. But that it always is like that. You never really know. And in most cases, reaction is actually the most likely outcome.
But we're seeing right now with the Republican Party.
Right. But the problem that it's going to be is the same problem that you always have with reaction, is that it's unstable and unsustainable. Like Trotsky that's why Trotsky wasn't particularly worried about fascism in a lot of ways, because he thought it was unstable and unsustainable. And it was unstable and unsustainable, but it could kill a whole lot of people in the interim.
Yeah.
So, and that's what you don't want. And also, as I pointed out to a liberal friend of mine who I interviewed recently, I don't know if it will come before or after this one, so I'm not going to say who it was, that there's also all kinds of things that can happen, such as centrist military juntas that you don't see on the horizon that happen very quickly in response to either the right or the left. You could see total systemic breakdown. I like to remind people that Sri Lanka, for example, was considered a fairly wealthy middle-income country, wealthier more per capita than India. They just collapsed like in a week. So these complicated systems rise and fall very, very quickly, and the hegemonic powers, or even the great powers, not even when you have a hegemon, because I think we're getting out of a hegemon period. That's what I would say, no matter what. Because it is clear that like China both does not want to and can't recapitulate the role of the United States in the 1950s. But when you look at all this in a kind of long durée way, you're like, there's no way that something major doesn't happen. And in the chaos, there is a lot of room for major change. But I think people need to understand that I think when change comes upon us, it's going to be quickly, and it's going to look like a mad dash. And part of what you want to do is just survive the other counter forces during the mad dash. Like, you know,
I mean, to your point, this is like I think a fairly well-known anecdote with Lenin, but I don't know if your audience knows about it. But Lenin like wrote about how he when he was very young, he believed he would never see revolution in his lifetime. And then 1905 happened, like 4 years later. But I think one thing we can take solace in is the fact that, like, I think there's like two things I always keep in mind, or three things. Like, number one, like, you really cannot predict the future.
No.
Weltgeist is uncontrollable by both the left and the right. Number two,
you can look at statistical likelihood, and maybe this is where we have deviated from classical Marxism, who thought communism was inevitable, and most of us are like, well, not with any sort of modern reasoning. It's not. But there are ways in which you can, like, even if something is highly probable, like the big misunderstanding about the Trump election, where Nate Silver actually has a point, right? Where, like, look, we said that it was like 45% likely that he won. Well, 45% is not a small margin of error. Just because the predictability of something is not over 50% doesn't mean it can't happen. In fact, unless it's very small, it's almost eventually always going to happen.
Right.
So in that sense, I think that this period is a period of hope, but it's also a period of terror.
Yes.
And
that leads to my
don't know what's coming.
That leads to my second point, which is that workers always find means of resistance, even against regimes or security apparatuses that seem like unbeatable. And this is like a point that, like, my point 2 and point 3 is directed towards like my leftist friends on Twitter, or people who may be watching this, is that like, the system is always unbeatable until it isn't. Like, there are no contradictions within like an unbeatable panopticon until there are blind spots. And the worker is always in the process of like trying to just literally go about their day, maybe not even intending on this becoming like an important moment. Always find they in the process of just living out their lives, resisting, find means of resistance that very often are the chink points in the armor. And number 3, this is a point that I want to make very clear to the audience and my leftist friends on Twitter. You should not be black-pilled, or alternatively speaking, if your newsfeed is primarily focused on the West, meaning the United States and Europe, then you by no means should be black-pilled, because you do not know what's going on outside of that core, which is not a small part of the world, but is only a part of the world.
Right. Like, although I do take I actually do kind of think we do have to take the classical Marxist dictum that a revolution has to happen in core as well.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing that like, oh, the third world is going to save us. I think that's very foolish and like very often the excuse not to take action. But like, nevertheless, one should not be black-pilled, especially when like worker struggle is happening everywhere in like places where you don't know about, places where you don't understand in terms of the political situations. Like, things are happening, even if your newsfeed is just like 400 mentally ill leftists on Twitter. So
yeah, I mean, I'm literally writing an article talking about the category of the parasocial, Lash's use of narcissism, and the way, and just statistical analysis to point out that both a lot of the immediate reformist hope and a lot of the black pillness emerges more from emotional relationships to key media figures than it does from any objective analysis, which is why I just refuse to talk about optimism or pessimism. I mean, I actually think pessimism in regards to the capitalist system is correct.
Yeah.
But pessimism in regards to human beings is a completely different question. And optimism is usually either used to justify what you already believe or to justify the status quo. And I think that's stupid. But I just want to move away from that language. Like the language of struggle should not be the language of hope or despair. It's the language of struggle. Like I think Mike Davis's quote about Leningrad and the Nazis is most of them. It doesn't matter if you think you're going to fucking win. You still fight because you don't know. And there's no way to know. Right? Like there are things, even in the most dire situations, that could save your ass in major shifts. Like for example, I think in the short run, yes, it is almost inevitable that the Democrats are fucked. You should make it about a domestic politics, right? Yeah. And that the left in most of the world, in the core economies, is fucked. There are some exceptions, but that's the immediate run. Because the problems that plague the centrist left and the centrist liberals, who the left has kind of, even when it says it hasn't, teamed up with, aren't going to go away, regardless of, whether or not the GOP or some other power even takes over. They are going to still be here, and there are going to still be problems. And politically, that means that the dissatisfaction currently aimed at the Democrats is going to be aimed at their neighbors. And in fact, I think we might even see that now anyway, where we live through a moment that, yes, favors the right, but it's very throw the bastards out in an anti-systemic moment. But that doesn't mean reaction is going to win in the long term. And I'm not just saying that as a palliative. I'm saying that because it's a sincere belief of mine. Yeah. Like the evidence is not that the immediate future is fairly predictable once certain things have been done and said, and those things have not been done and said.
Especially since at the end of the day, the right cannot fix these problems because there's structural
right, exactly. Problems. So the idea that they're going to culture comp their way through this, like they might culture comp their way into power, but just like they couldn't culture comp or even war and terror their way out of the problems of the aughts, they won't be able to do it again. Right. This has also been true for Democrats, and I think, if anything, what our friends in like the DSA or whatever, depending on where you throw your political cards right now, need to take some heart from is, but also need to strategically deal with this within their own institutions, is that every assumption that you're currently making may be upended in the next 10 years because every assumption that we made in the prior 2 decades, for the most part, have been already upended.
Right.
I mean, let's just think about the number of things that, yes, ex-scholars have called, or even sometimes people like me have called, that have altered society. But like, for example, I did kind of see Occupy coming. I did not see Bernie coming, even though Bernie, given a lot of other things, given the revitalization of the workers' movement, which really also is not a recent thing. It's been a slow boiling thing. And it's one that I also point out was totally set back by COVID almost to year zero. So we're just getting back to where we were in 2019, basically right now. And that's a statistical fact. But that the resurgence of the workers' movement in America as a political force predates Bernie. All right. It is not the result of the Bernie Sanders campaign, but its relationship to the Bernie Sanders campaign is complicated. But there is a reason, and it was something that I didn't see, which I tell people when they feel utter despair, like when people are like, Trump's going to name himself dictator. People thought that about Bush too. Right. There's a reason that people don't see usually, where things are far more complicated than they think. And there's more room than they think. But what they have to do is change the way they interpret things, because I didn't see Bernie coming in 2016. I definitely did in 2020, but I didn't see him coming in 2016. I would have thought the Bernie Sanders campaign would have been, like Obama ran an outsider campaign as a moderate progressive, right? Wasn't actually a moderate progressive. Ended up being the most establishment guy probably ever. But whatever, that's the campaign he ran. We believed it. A lot of us believed it. Even people like me who are super cynical, who jumped off the boat before he even took the oath of office, believed it in the initial phases. So my point about that, is that none of these things were easily predictable from the assumptions of 2008. The rebirth of socialism was something that I saw, but saw on a much longer horizon than from 2012 to 2016. The collapse of that socialist movement, which I do think the 2020 election is a collapse of victory, which is funny because that also happened to the right too. Like the far right thought they had won in Trump, and they were quickly collapsed into normality really quickly. Which is when leftists recapitulate their hero story with Trump, I always remind them of, and I think that's something you who can be coming out of the right kind of understand. That also was something we didn't see coming. Trump was not something most of us saw coming, even though many of us knew something. I do feel like I knew somebody like Trump was possible. Basically, a demagogue who was going to represent this long-term fracturing of movement conservatism that was really beginning to show up in the mid-aughts, but had dominated U.S. politics since Reagan, even on the Democratic side, really. Because the Democratic side had let the movement conservatives set all the terms. That fracturing was going to come, right? But again, how it came surprised the fuck out of me.
Yeah.
Like, once I saw Trump, I knew there was a possibility Trump could win. I remember even putting out the snarky ass tweet in 2015, don't let an Obama mania turn into a Trump-geddon or something like that. Which, this was very early on. As soon as he announced his category, I'm like, you guys think that this is funny. And again, Democrats love to do this shit. They love to like cynically try to play far right candidates and get people to vote for them to try to depower something, and all of a sudden they just empowered a counter systemic movement within their enemies that's also aiming for them.
Oops.
Yeah. But I do think, I guess the long and short of it is to say, like, don't be black-pilled. There's no reason to be black-pilled. There's a reason why, even though everybody saw elements of this or that coming, none of us saw it all. Even the best of us. Even someone like Mike Davis, who's to me one of the, best living Marxists. Hopefully he's still alive today, because he doesn't have much longer with us. But even the best of us didn't see everything. Right?
Yeah.
None of us can. Which is why these conversations, I think most of left media is stupid parasocial relationships that'll destroy your mind. But I also think these conversations some of these conversations are still important. And if there is any function of left media other than entertainment, it is so these conversations can happen so that people can take them and use them in politics. It is not because they are political in and of themselves. They're not.
I mean, this is something that I kind of bring up with the George Floyd uprisings, where people got, leftists, especially, a lot of them post-leftists were like, oh yeah, well, like, look what happened. Nothing happened. Police got all their money, super funded, all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that's true. Like, not much changed, like, aesthetically. But you got to keep in mind that, like, millions of people took part in these protests and these uprisings. And that's millions of people with, like, memory, like, lived memory, that, like, that saw this movement kind of collapse and was co-opted by these elements. And through their lived experiences, we now have millions of people, like, the next time a moment like that happens, can apply their experiences so that co-option and that collapse won't happen again. Now people tell me that that's cope. You're coping, Jules. But I think we do have to keep in mind that, like, not every loss is a total loss, because in order to, like, learn, like losing is sometimes an okay consolation if that means we now have more people with like with actual concrete experience in participating in these events and can build something out of them. So even in the moments where we think we can be black-pilled, like that is not necessarily like the cause to be totally black-pilled. Every movement has their L's. Every movement has their losses.
Well, I'm going to not tell you that's cope, but I am going to tell you there is a dialectical tension in that, because what it depends on. I actually wrote a long time ago, I wrote a blog post about this, about Occupy. I was like, Occupy is doomed to fail. That is not the problem. The problem is what lessons are learned.
Right.
And when I started studying path dependency and systems theory, what I came to the conclusions of, there are decision points, and there are decision points in a system where there is actual like systemic things, and counter systemic things tend to work in predictable ways until they don't, right? There are moments of change and movement. But then the question becomes, and in this I think this is why I'm like, this is why I talk about things like revolutionary pessimism, but I've moved away from that language because it confuses people, where I'm like, you need to adopt the null scenario, all right? Kind of scientifically almost. What happens if your assumptions are false? All right. Then go, what can I learn from what I just did if either my assumptions are true or my assumptions are false? If either my predators don't hold up or they do. All right. So you have to kind of work out
So would the null here be like, what if people take the wrong lessons from this?
Right. What if they're path dependent on failed strategies, right? And becoming more so, which I think actually is true, right? But that does not mean they will always be path dependent on failed strategies. All right. The DSA was one of the most morbid political organizations on the American left. It is now the largest that cannibalized many others. Now, it is now in a different cul-de-sac than it was for most of its history. And it will probably, frankly, decline. Like the SDS, it may even fall apart. The question becomes not whether or not it was good and bad that the DSA existed. Right? That is a sectarian question, and it's not particularly useful. The question becomes, what are you learning from what has happened now? And are you going to double down on your error, which is a human possibility, and frankly the most likely option? Or are you going to learn? And what I will say, and this is where I am not a pessimist about people, all right, as a whole, when collapse comes, right, even civilizational collapse, almost always a fair number of that civilization survives because people are not that dumb. Yeah. They will adjust even to a hyper complex system. It may be because the system can't simplify itself and another system must emerge, or another civilization, which is, you know, I think civilizational language is another thing that's in systems theory that makes Marxists uncomfortable. But I think in this case it's true, because I think capitalism is a worldwide industrial civilization, of which there is almost nobody who's not at least in its periphery, unless you're like some hunter-gatherers on an island somewhere off the coast of Indonesia or Sri Lanka or something. That there is this vacancy in this, and there are people learning lessons. The struggle, the battle, the political battle within the left will always be who learned the best lessons and can they win.
Yeah.
If the people who learn bad lessons win, and they do often win, that counter-systemic movement will die and another one will take its place. And many of the people in the losing counter-systemic movement will move to the better one. Right? Unfortunately, right now, what I think we're seeing is a lot of people learn bad lessons during both Occupy and the Bernie Sanders campaign and are moving right without being honest about it.
Yeah.
And we're in a very right-wing moment. I think in the immediate future, we need to admit that we're in a very right-wing moment. But I also want people to. This is where I'm going to agree with you, right? The right thought that its moment was 2016, and then actually collapsed and has been almost delusional, and the base level in response to that, despite the fact that the Republicans have in some ways started to deal with their contradictions in realignment. They have not totally done it. And in fact, sadly, if either Trump or DeSantis runs, it stalls that. And maybe we get some scary people beyond those two coming up in the future. What we have learned from the Democrats is they will not learn the right lessons.
Yeah.
And so this is where, like, this path dependency thing, this is where I'm like shaking my DSA friends and being like, they will never learn. They will not learn. They refuse to learn for reasons that are complicated and are not just moral. They're not just about Joe Biden being a dithering old man, which is undoubtedly the case, but that's not really the point.
Yeah.
But you can learn. You are a counter-systemic movement within this thing. You can become something else still. You have the power to do that. Are you going to do it? And this is where I'm like, I don't have a lot of hope in the DSA anymore, but I do have hope of the people who are in the DSA. I know it's weird.
I understand exactly what you're talking about. Like, I know some excellent people in the DSA who are in the DSA because there's just no other organization out there.
Right. And they don't want to go back to the sectarian left either. Like, we don't want to go back to the whole period from the mid 70s all the way to like basically 2015, where we were divided up over like a bajillion little weird sects that only could really operate on campus and only could ever reach like 5,000 people. It seemed to be their weird limit. I've been trying to mathematically work that out, why that was a weird limit, but it kind of was. Like, and you know, regardless of what they are, Stalinist, Marxist, whatever, Marxist-Leninist, sorry, Stalinist, I don't mean to offend you for your inability to say what you are. I personally think you should own it, but everybody else does. I guess Trotskyists do the whole we're Leninists, we're just not Marxist-Leninists, which is always weird because they try to claim also to be more orthodox, but whatever. My point about this has been, there's a couple points. One is I no longer think these nomenclatures super predictive anymore. They're more aesthetic choices. And two, and I think this is the more important one, we don't want to go back to that sectarian world because we all kind of realized that it didn't do anything, and that it's not particularly useful, and you're never gonna small cadre build your ultra sect one worker at a time, even doing entryism and, you know, this, that, and the other. The question becomes, how do you transform the DSA into something that is not reliant on the Democrats, not just because their immediate political prospects are utterly shit, but because they're path dependently stuck and seemingly cannot learn certain lessons. And I could actually go, like, I have game theoretical reasons why I think that's true. Like, there's reasons why they can't learn those lessons that are systemic to the legal system of the United States, that if they learn those lessons, it would actually lead to an existential crisis, right? So in that sense, if you're caught up in the system, in the world system, I think the problem with the left in most of the world system right now, and this almost sounds like a post-left critique, but I actually think it comes out of just traditional leftism, is that we're stuck as being kind of an anti-systemic movement, but also afraid of the other side in the moment of scutter that's going to come, that we can feel coming already. that we're not willing to totally abandon the system. So we end up being like, you know, what I call the Sam Cedar problem are any of these problems where you might be a true, honest, diehard critiquer of the Democrats and sincerely believe it, but you're not going to do anything about it because you're too afraid of the alternative to risk the Democrats losing. Conversely,
you have leftists who are like, once like, I don't like the Democrats, but they're afraid of the C word. They're afraid to call themselves communist, or even socialist, or like their conception of socialism is just like worker cooperatives.
Yeah, I was about to say there's a whole lot of people, even anarchists, who are they're just like, we need worker co-ops. I'm like, that's, you know, but that answer actually, interestingly enough, as I pointed out to people before, ranges in every of these quote political tendencies except Trotskyism. That actually doesn't happen in Trotskyism. But like, I'm like, so look at the Democratic Socialists. Well, half of them, including my friend Ben Burgess, are co-opists. Look at Asatar Bear, who's a Marxist-Leninist, but still somehow a co-opist. Look at a lot of anarcho-syndicalists that are basically co-opists, but like with radical democratic federalism at the firm level or something. And I'm just like, that's not like, that doesn't really fix the problem. It makes the problem more humane, I guess, but the dynamics of competition and whatnot are still going to play out in very similar veins. And we know this actually from the very same studies that you indicate about how it's more humane. We know it from Mondragon and from long-term co-op developments in the UK and this, that, and the other. Like, we know what happens. Like, would it be better? Yes. Is it worth fighting for? Sure. But it doesn't fix the problem, right? But you also see this timidity in the way people brand themselves. But I think that the other tendency you see is people who will claim to be Marxist or socialist, but who, you know, see the problems of the left, and even when the problems of the left that they see are correct, all right, some of the stuff post leftists say is true. Like we they still can't imagine not tailing something. They can't imagine what true socialist independence from this capitalist dynamic would be. And I get why it's hard to imagine. Like I always tell people, like, left communism claiming that this is the left of capital is ridiculous, because everything right now is the left of capital. What non-capitalist society is there? This is not about what you believe in your heart, right? Like, so to say left of capital that somehow you're not is special pleading.
Yeah.
But in the sense to be independent from the already existing left of capital is hard, and it's hard to do. And even people who critique the left for not being independent enough often end up just tailing the right. You see it over and over and over again. You know, if it's out of despair, out of pragmatism, out of cynicism, whatever, right? And so when I ask people to be brave, it's not about hope. It's about, like, we have to be brave and begin to see how we can do this in a way, even electorally, that starts to take us away from being tied to the Democratic Party as an identity, and being willing to go, we don't care if some of you lose or if all of you lose, because we'll replace you.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, like, I get it. Like, it's terrifying. I mean, I've been reading about what the GOP is wanting to do if Trump wins in 2024, because Trump like learned his lesson from 2016 about just going in there. Because if he doesn't have like his guys in there, and if he's just working off of like old guard Republicans, then he can't actually exact most parts of his agenda aside from like cutting taxes. But over the past 4 years, we have seen the construction of a large leadership, a large new right apparatus whose purpose is to staff Trump with the necessary personnel he needs that can execute his vision if he wins in 2024. And like what he has on his plate right now, I mean, it's nightmarish. It's kind of scary. Like I get.
It's gutting the entire civil service apparatus, and what is it in Plan F or whatever?
Civil service apparatus, basically giving like ICE carte blanche to do whatever they want, really.
And then the long-term project is this project that's been actually predates Trump, to call basically an amendment convention, and then
the convention of states.
A convention of states, initially to just pass one amendment or so, but what they're actually aiming to do is rewrite the Constitution, which they would be able to do legally, totally legally.
So look, I get it. It's terrifying, but like, nevertheless, and this is the sad thing, is that like, it is still necessary to like find a way to like, wean ourselves off of the Democratic Party, because every single election year is the election year. Like, if we don't do something, like,
right. Well, let's talk about
Caesarism's coming.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I've been predicting Caesarism for a long time, and I was like, I don't know which side it's going to come from, but what I'm learning is it's not going to come from the Democrats, because they're path-dependent cowards. Yeah. So, and I don't necessarily think Democratic Caesarism would have been good either. Like, don't get me wrong. People sometimes hear me as like, no, that's not what I'm saying. But it is almost inevitable at this point with our Constitution that will happen. Yeah. Everything cannot be an incoherent constitutional crisis. Even the right knows that. So for all its peddling of constitutionalism, it actually does understand the game and is playing it. Democrats do not seem to understand the game. And the reason why I think it's existential horror, because they would have to admit to some things that, for example, the current undoing of the legal apparatus was actually done by them because they were cowardly in fixing the Constitution when they had the power to do so in the 60s. Yeah. And instead of continuing with a bunch of amendments that they gave time for due to the Warren Court giving them some space, what they did was allowed for a very successful grassroots and astroturf. But people who say it's not grassroots, going from church to church to do this is pretty grassroots. Yeah. Movement to completely destroy, the Equal Rights Amendment, and then that completely gutted their ability to really deal with the constitutional contradictions in which they were dealing with, right? And the right actually tells this narrative fairly honestly, which is kind of funny, because I'm like, it's true. The whole living Constitution bullshit was a smoke and mirrors game to buy you time, and then you decided you didn't need the time. Yeah. The Warren Court was really an exceptional point in the Supreme Court's history, in that, like, you actually look at the Supreme Court, most of its history is just, I know reactionary is like kind of a loaded term here. We're not being scientific Marxists, I guess. But that's like the only way I could describe it, is that the Supreme Court... It's like, institutionally conservative 99% of the time, and functionally conservative like 80% of the time. Yeah, right. Like, I think it's a good way of putting that. And the Democrats had that one window where they could actually do something, and they just didn't. And now the conservatives have a super majority in the Supreme Court and have basically stacked the entire federal court system. And the Democrats have aided them on that. When we say, like, I'm sorry, it's not good enough to just critique the Democratic Party anymore. You have to actually hold them accountable. Yeah. And if you can have the best critique in the world, but if you wily around them every single time, it's meaningless. But what I'm also saying is, if you go and run to the right because of that, you're a traitor, and you should be held accountable. Yeah. And, I'm not saying that some of those people can't come back, right? But what I am saying is they will be held accountable, or we don't mean anything. And like this is a systemic logic problem, right? Right now, I think we have to accept, and here's what we have to accept, and this is going to be very painful for people, Their belief that the Democrats would protect us from authoritarianism has ensured, more than even the authoritarian forces themselves did when they were in power, that they will now be authoritarian in the future.
Yeah. No, yeah.
That to me is an undeniable result of this, because and the idea that the average person is going to believe that this is the most dangerous election in the history of elections, since they pulled this stunt for so long, even when it is, this is over now. Like, that game is over. We cannot play it anymore. Our game has to be different. Because what we don't want to be is stuck in, like, the UK, which is the example of a possible future for the United States, where no matter what failure happens, it's just a different faction of the right that's going to be able to come up and battle it out, because the permanent opposition party is not really interested in representing anybody but a fairly narrow core of professional interest, and thus cannot and will not and doesn't even really want to take power again. And so what you have is just inter-right infighting deciding the future of the UK, which is likely what will happen with Trump, because Trump is a very old man and he doesn't have a doctrine. So even if he achieves what he wants to do, and what he wants to do is a classic authoritarian move, which will also gut the Republicans' ability to rule in the future.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it will do. Because he's going to basically, I mean, it's a 70-something-year-old narcissist trying to turn this into a family dynasty without the competence that even he has beneath him.
Yeah. I mean, it'll basically be like what happened after, like, Charlemagne died. Like, his
exactly.
entire kingdom split up between all these different claimants.
And all the old Republican guard isn't going to go away. A lot of them are pretending to be Trumpists to wait until he's out of the system, because they know he's going to die.
Yeah.
Like, he's old.
It's incredible that he's still alive. I mean, all he eats is McDonald's. It's incredible.
No, I mean, you know, some
people,
of that health advice is probably overstated, but
he's got that old Dutch stock in him.
What I'm gonna say is, like, it doesn't really it doesn't really matter, because Trumpism, even in the worst case scenario, even if you got rid of the amendments that limit presidential terms, he's 16 years older than Putin.
Jesus.
16 years? Yeah, he is. Because Putin's only like 61.
Wow, he's pretty young.
Putin, well, he's not in great health. He's had cancer multiple times, but Putin is 69, excuse me, and Trump is, so it's not 16 years. I am wrong about that. Trump is blah, blah, blah. Trump is 76. He's 8 years older than Putin, but still, like Putin's not establishing his legacy for the future anymore. So the idea that like we're going to be under eternal Trumpism, when Trumpism does not yet have a coherent doctrine, it did under Bannon, but actually lost it because of his concessions to the Democrats. I mean, not to Democrats, to the Republicans. Even I'm screwing that up. I think we can fairly say, you know, this will come out in September. I think we can fairly say that in November, you know, we don't even know that these people, given how old they are going to survive.
Yeah,
to 2024. The only person that we for sure know will probably be around, barring some freak accident or something, is Ron DeSantis, and that, as horrible as it is a different game. It will still probably gut a lot of the stuff, but the thing is, what I can tell you is the stasis that we're in, that the left unfortunately participated in when Bernie Sanders refused to stay and became a systemic candidate, not an anti-systemic candidate. And that is the one thing out of the post-left that I think they're right about. I don't think they're right about why or that he was selling out. I think that once that decision was made in 2016, there wasn't many ways for him to viably ever be serious and not do it. But it was, it is a fact. And that he feels like he can be useful as an internal opposition. Right. Well, internal opposition and sheepdog are kind of the same thing. And I say that because I actually do think sometimes you need an internal opposition. Like, that's not my point. But like, whether or not someone's an alternative on an internal opposition or whether or not they're a sheepdog really depends on the moment and the context. And so in my mind, Bernie Sanders is both. And that is not a moral judgment on him. Like, that's what, if anything, I've been trying to push people away from these moral judgments and parasocial relationships with particular politicians. It's not useful. Think about this in terms of systems and likelihoods. And the only time the moral judgment is useful for holding people in your movement accountable, if you can hold them accountable. But let's be honest, we can't hold Bernie Sanders accountable, even if we wanted to.
No.
Right? Like, the DSA doesn't have the power to do that. I don't have the power to do that. You don't have the power to do that. This is why so many of left Twitter discourse is useless.
Yeah, because what's being fought over is e-clout. That's the thing that's being held accountable over you. It's taking away your e-clout.
Like, so who gives a shit? Like, unless you're a person who makes money off your e-clout. And yes, there's plenty of people who do. I guess technically I am one of them, but you know what? If you cancel my e-clout, it would make my life harder. But I would more or less still have a roof over my head and food, so it doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah.
You would hurt my ability to donate to other podcasts, give stuff to political causes, and buy role-playing books. But but inflation is doing that anyway, so six does one way, half does the other.
I think the thing that I want to kind of touch on here is like, bring back to Wallerstein with like the
let's bring it back to Wallerstein as our final point.
Yeah, with like to kind of talk about the system versus anti-systemic movement, and with like the American crisis that we're seeing now. I do think that something does have to give, because I think in the moment that we're in, where American capitalism is kind of in a long crisis, we're not in like we're not.
I would say not just American capitalism, really capitalism.
Global capitalism.
Yeah.
Like with the world system like kind of in decay right now, and doubling up on that, like America as a whole being less and less able to govern itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's the irony of this to me. Just just to interject, we theoretically are actually best positioned, even if deglobalization happens, to weather it. But our internal political, legal, and infrastructural contradictions are making that impossible. It is not because we don't have the resources. We actually do, and that is the great irony. Europe doesn't, but we do.
Right.
And that's the great irony of the situation.
Like, in this moment where so many things are possible, a lot of leftists feel like people like leftists on Twitter feel like nothing feels possible, and that the road of possibility is closed. But the thing I say here is that in an anti-systemic movement, and in the decay of the world system, as Wallerstein would put it, something's going to happen with the gridlock, the constitutional political American gridlock, because these things don't last too long. Like, something happens.
They've lasted actually inordinately long for us, which is also why I agree with you, because something has to happen. Like the bourgeoisie will not forever. Like, if people like the PMC run everything, maybe they do. I don't, I'm not even sure the PMC are a thing, but maybe you're right. Except the bourgeoisie won't stay silent and gone forever. We're not in a period of monopoly capital.
Right. When we kind of look at it, like, I think the gridlock will probably be will be shattered by the right if Trump wins in 2024. I don't know if that'll happen. I don't even know if he'll stay alive until then. But if that does happen, and he does enact all these different things, not only is a reaction unsustainable, as you kind of alluded to earlier, but also none of the solutions the right have are viable long-term solutions, because the problems of the world system, as Wallerstein put it very well, are structural.
Yep. So yeah, like we might be entering a very long period, and you know, to put it in like terms that liberals might understand, it might happen here. Not just Europe anymore, but end of American. I mean, in some ways, I think Trump is the glaring. And what's funny is he'll even say it. He actually doesn't believe in American exceptionalism, which is hilarious. Like
that's a more and more common thing on the right. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think we have to deal with is the fact we ceded anti-systemic energy to the right. In the coalition with and in our, there's historical reasons for this. Go all the way back to the U.S. experience of the Popular Front being different from the European experience of the Popular Front, and it being bad for us, but also seeming good, where it was much better for Europe, but also ultimately ended up not working. That I think informs a lot of this. But I go, the system's still here, and it's still decaying, and it's a system, and it's not just the U.S. And that's the other thing where I keep on going, stop it with these other people saving you shit. You got to get that out of your head, because the stuff that you can link up to may come from other places. And in the United States, we really should be operating with the purview in the entirety of North America.
Yeah.
Right? At minimum. But I do get weirded out when people like really focused on South America or Asia or whatever, and I'm like, your entire logistics stream is in North America, and maybe you should start building relationships and alliances with like people in Canada and Mexico. Just saying.
We just got to kick back and let JD Pond like do all the work. It's that easy. Asia, Africa, they got this. They're going to do a revolution, and then we'll just follow in their coattails. It's that simple.
Well, I mean, a lot of those people think we've already had the revolution, and I'm just like, okay, whatever, man. I don't know how you think that. I mean, I think that's interestingly because of Wallerstein's Maoist origins and all this. I mean, because he was politically Maoist in the 60s. I think sometimes I have to be like, listen to your forebears who see this as a fucking world system, and quit making excuses for nations.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a true Maoist, or at least the
old Maoists hated China, by the way. Like,
yeah. Not only do they hate China, but like if you're like a Maoist who's all about JD Pond, that includes like a large number of people in America, like the domestic colony thesis. Like we have a whole like subaltern class in America that like are generally colored, but not necessarily all colored. You don't have to work in China or Africa.
Well, I mean, any attempt to remove it down to one identity that is not class-based, which is what usually this thing falls down to, whether it's the students, the precariat. The precariat's a little different because my argument with precariat is not that it's wrong. It's that like we already have the social tools to talk about this in Marxism, and they're clearer.
Yeah.
Which is the lumpenization of proletarian parts of of society, and then you have the petit bourgeoisification of other parts of the proletariat, like the educated parts, in the term of and labor aristocracy. But by the way, proletarianization also means that that's not totally relevant to whether or not you should politically accept them, because anyone who, as Marx says in the manifesto, explicitly and undeniably, anyone who throws their lot in with the proletariat is effectively part of the political movement of the proletariat. whatever their class origins, our current position. If that's where they see the future and that's where they aim, that's where they politically are.
You're part of the real movement.
Right. They're part of the real movement of the proletariat. So all these attempts to limit that for whatever weird reason that people have. And I think most of it is clout. Some of it is cargo cult building. Some of it may be even sincere, but it doesn't matter. You know, it's like the anarchists who always throw at you, well, no Marxist was actually a worker, which is like, that's not true, but no Marxist leadership was. And why would you expect them to be? Because who has the time and the skills to learn this shit? It isn't magically removed because of the nobility of labor.
He spent 13 hours in like the London library looking over like wheat import statistics. It's a miracle that he was a good father to begin with. How much time he was spending.
He wasn't always a good father either, but I mean, like, it's something to think about, right? Like that was the, like, whatever you think about the Vanguard thesis, I don't know that I accept it, but I do think that when Marx talks about the socialist movement merging with the advanced parts of the proletariat, that's why. Those are the two parts that are educated. He wasn't talking about the politically advanced parts. He was talking about the parts that had enough labor and time to learn shit. And then the difference is, and this is where I'm like more of a radical socialist than a lot of people, and maybe some people think I'm a left communist. I think that means empowering even the non-advanced parts in political decision making. Like, they have to have input. Like, right. That's what the dictatorship of the proletariat is. That's what classlessness eventually is everybody gets input. They don't necessarily get what they want in everything all the time, but they at least have an equal say in the possibility of what that is. And that's, you know, that's part of what we're promising. You know, and that on that scenario, I think, you know, maybe we should end it. But I do think the anti-systemic stuff is important, and it's important to remove it from anti-capitalists. And this is another thing I think you can take from Wallerstein, because people have noticed that who plays the anti-systemic role temporarily since 1968 has shifted back and forth between the right and the left. And neither one of them have really been able to crack the system in the way that they want. Because what the right really wants, we used to think about conservatism as preserving the system, and that I think we need to start thinking about them as reactions, because nobody, except for the centrists, really wants to preserve the system.
Yeah.
Increasingly, nobody likes the system. What they want to replace it with is wildly different. I mean, in the case of someone like neo-reactionaries, it's literally anti-human Terminator tentacle beast. But
yeah, I mean, this is something that Lisa McGurr in her book Suburban Warriors does a great job of pointing out, where she taught, like, her book basically focuses on like Orange County and the creation of the Reagan coalition amongst white middle class homeowners. And the point that she brings out is like, these are not people who are like trying to conserve traditional values. Like, the process of like the new modern conservatism of the 60s was a new ideology built out of a new way of life from like these kind of newish material conditions that was both backward looking and forward looking. So I think you're right on the money there.
Right. And so I actually, you know, I get this from Demestra of all people. I'm like, no, the conservatives are a sign of a dying regime. Reactionaries are something new. And reactionaries actually understand that they are in a dialectical tension with revolutionary forces, whether that be the left or something else. And that neither one of them want the ancien regime anymore. The ancien regime is lost. Like, and I think conservatives understand that better than leftists and liberals do about their enemies, which is why they can play anti-systemic roles. And all we can do is call them fascist. And I actually think that's something people miss about fascism. Fascism was an anti-systemic reactionary with elements of conservatism, leftism, liberalism, and progressivism in its DNA. It was inherently unstable and incoherent. But it was an anti-systemic movement that became a total, that tried to answer a system with a total system that ended up restoring parts of liberalism in a crisis, right? And that's sort of my answer to all these shorthands you hear about fascism, or like fascism is liberalism in crisis, or this, that, and the other. I'm like, no, what it is, I mean, fascism is that, but fascism is also leftism in crisis. It's also conservatism in crisis. There are different elements of the system in crisis that form this unstable, highly authoritarian, totalizing new system that also is aiming to preserve parts of the current system that is unmaintainable. And while I don't think Trumpism and fascism are one-to-one the same thing, I really don't. And I think, unfortunately, I think calling it that is actually going to make it harder to fight as it mutates into something else in the future. But I do think it is like that there's so many different things in it. Like when people try to reduce Trumpism to just white nationalism, they're blindsided by something. Or when they try to reduce it to just right populism, they're blindsided by something. It's a coalition that's different from the movement conservative coalition, and there are actual fascists in it. But it's a multifaceted thing that one side hasn't won or not yet. And that was what made the Trump administration so fucking weird. Is different sides would win week to week almost.
It's kind of similar to like when you read the history of like fascism as an idea, and like before World War I and during World War I, your eyes just kind of bulge because you have scholars being like, yeah, it's basically like a bunch of really annoyed Italian socialists getting together with a bunch of syndicalists.
And then this radical conservative movement from France, and like, it's like, and these national anarchists and syndicalists. What the fuck is a national anarchist and syndicalist?
Then you how, like, Mussolini was himself a socialist for a while before he actually started getting into like fascism, and you're like, wow.
But you want to talk about it craziness? He made an accelerationist argument for Italy entering World War I, got burnt because he actually fought in it, and then picked up the fascist arguments by doing so, and flipped from his accelerationist to an Italy restorationist, but took a whole lot of the intellectual apparatus of the socialists with him, including the prime theorist of fascism, Giovanni Gentile, who was praised by Lenin himself.
Yeah, like this is where I think you're dead on the money when it comes to like, there is not a one-to-one comparison between fascism and Trumpism, but I think there definitely rhyme. There is a one. Yeah, that's the thing. They rhyme in the sense that they both are like incredibly incoherent and are like in this intention with so many different other like inner ideologies that it baffles scholars to like define what it is, even after like 7 years of Trump winning the presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, they don't really know how to do it. I mean, Enzo Traverso is probably the closest person with his para and post-fascist stuff and pointing out how it rhymes and how it doesn't. But I will say Traverso's not, I think, even though a lot of social democrats and all kinds of Marxists like him, he's not easy for them to swallow in a lot of ways, because it does mean like it rhymes, but it's not the same thing, and thus you can't quite use the same strategies to fight it. And the one thing I can tell you is the militant Antifa/Popular Front model, which was adapted. People will argue with me, but if you have me go vote for Biden, you're arguing for a popular front, right? Like, you're not just arguing for me to fight fascist on policy electorally and then fight them otherwise. You're arguing for a popular front. That strategy clearly did not work.
Yeah.
Because we underestimated the banality and the path dependency of the Democratic Party, which is hard to do. I mean, like, because most people realize it was a problem, but now I have to like tell people, like, we have to vote the fascists out. Like, well, you did that and it didn't work because the Democrats were not willing to do anything at all because their whole logic isn't coherent. So you can't make that argument again, and you're not going to make that argument again with the general public.
Right.
It is not because they're complacent against fascism. It's because you literally didn't do anything about that, and also everything else got worse. So, you know, like, that's the kind of...
Yeah, even when you like vote out the fascists or like the Trumpists, like the underlying structural problems of the American government, as well as like the inert political party that is the Democratic Party, just means that you bought yourself another 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, and I think in this case you may have accelerated it afterwards too, honestly.
Oh yeah, I mean, Donald Trump, if he wins, like he's coming back with like a whole infrastructure of personnel that he's built up to basically replace the deep state, whatever you want to call it, the civil service state.
The question becomes, honestly, does the military let him? And I don't think people really want to think about what that means. I had a more liberal friend saying, like, look, if that happens, I feel like I'm picking the lesser of two evils between two different military juntas. And I'm like, you're picking different evils, my friend. Like,
it is quite bizarre that our American military seems especially and uniquely apolitical.
Right.
Like, yeah, that is something I wish more people would like write an analysis on, because that is something I'm really interested in. The question is like why that is.
I think, however, January 6th and the general's response to that actually does indicate their line of apoliticality. That found it.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because they're the overseers more than any other part of the government of American capital, because they ensure the fucking sea trade.
Oh yeah.
Like, that's the elephant in the room that even people are like, well, you could take the money here and invest in infrastructure. I'm like, not and maintain global trade exchange. You can't.
No, yeah.
Like,
how do you think we can get our imperial super profits?
Right. Well, I mean, or even just general trade. But yes. And again, this is world system. This is weirdly where like some right-ish centrist liberals like Peter Zion and Wallerstein actually overlap, because they understand this. They understand the military empire is not just built on to capital. It's not something that we could just do away with and be like Norway. The only way Norway can be Norway is because this exists.
Yes.
That is like when MLs like go like, well, social democracy is dependent on imperialism. I'm like, well, yeah, because all of capitalism is.
Yeah, I mean, this is my problem with like map rooting. Like, I love map rooting. I think
we disagree on our love of map rooting, but go ahead.
I love the Brunings, but I disagree tremendously with this idea of like, oh yeah, we can do a big welfare state in America. We just have to adjust these numbers and we're good. That's it. Just adjust the numbers. It's like I don't think that's true. Especially when
I don't think you understand what you're saying, man. Like,
you're kind of underselling what we have to do to get that Norway-sized welfare state.
Right. Well, I mean, this is also my argument when people think you can do MMT without imperial policy. Yeah. And honestly, that's become both a trope on both the left and the right, because the national conservatives also believe this bullshit.
I mean, this is something one of my friends pointed out, where is like, yeah, one of the interesting things with like in 2016 with Trump and Bernie is that you saw a mirror image of like the renationalization of politics, where both wanted to like renationalize the economy. Trump emphasizing the immigration stuff, Bernie re-emphasizing the welfare and union stuff. But those are necessarily like upon those things are like preconditions of like imperial hegemony.
Right. Totally. This is what I talked about with one of the ironies and the retreatment. one of the reasons why I actually saw the socialist renewal as having a conservative element to it was the retreatment back to the retreatment from methodological nationalism to systemic nationalism to political nationalism on both the left and the right, in ways that blinded people to the largesse of the problem.
Right.
Largeness of the problem, because it's not something that you like. When I'm like, okay, yeah, if the Fed can set policy and fix our economy, it also fixes the world economy, you dipshits.
Yeah.
Like, which means it's the Federal Reserve Bank for the world, which, by the way, why does China not want to do that? Because it also constrains what the Federal Reserve Bank can do, because it's got to stop capitalism, as my friends from Max from Lines Down, and patrons will get a video, everybody else is going to get this only in audio, pointed out, the Federal Reserve Bank makes decisions about fiscal policy, about what it's going to do in response to financial crises and liquidity crises in fucking Indonesia. Let that sink in. Like, because one of the things that's been happening since 2000 is the liquidity exchanges between the central banks.
Yeah.
In fiat currency.
Well,
to maintain baskets of diverse currency flows. Like, yeah.
This is why Wallerstein, one of the many reasons why Wallerstein is worth reading, because like you have to look at this whole thing not as like nation state versus nation state, as a world system. To put it more vulgarly, like it's like that speech from Network, where he talks of have you ever seen Network?
Oh yeah, I did a whole podcast on it. It's my favorite movie from the 70s, probably.
Yeah, it's that iconic scene where I forgot the name of the television executive, but he basically says, there is no Russia, there is no United States, there is no China, there are only dollars, rubles, euros, and yen. It's flows. That's all it is. And as vulgar as that sounds, I mean, when it comes to
kind of true.
Yeah. When it comes to understanding like how global capital functions in world politics, that really does come down to this. That doesn't mean like ideas are like directly like, that doesn't mean everybody is consciously economically interested all the time, but it does mean that determines the like parameters of possibility in which like world leaders and movements operate in.
And I think that's a great point to end off on. Thank you, Jules, for coming back on. If anything, I would say one of my last critique of Lasch, and I agree, like we talked about, I actually think a lot of early Lasch is worth saving. I think a lot of middle Lasch is worth saving, even including cultural narcissism. Even though I'm rereading some chapters that they do seem more Jerry Mads than I used to be, they are based off the assumption of monopoly capital. In fact, he says so explicitly, and which is no longer, well, it was probably never true, but it's no longer true. Yeah. And the other thing that I would say is he did not understand capitalism as a world system enough. And I think that's why he gets into the cul-de-sac he gets in what I call the period of despair, which is the stuff that we were critiquing after 1987. Although his book on progress, I'm rereading it, and it's better than I remember it being, actually, but still. And so this is not unrelated to what we were talking about with Christopher Lasch, actually, is what I'm saying. Like, all this stuff is all related to each other, except when I do art stuff, and even that kind of is, but, and if you can't see how it's related and why, like a person obsessed with systems theory, complexity theory, cybernetics, but also world systems theory, ecology, ecological anthropology, how all these things interconnect, even with Marxism. If you don't get that, then you're going to have a hard time dealing with the complexity of the picture and the complexity that is unraveling right now.
Yep, totally agree.
Thanks, Jules, for coming on. People should check out your blog and not your blog.
Substack?
your Substack and your Twitter. And you'll probably be back on when we talk more immediate things. I'm glad that we talked about this. Maybe in the future we talk about a specific Wallerstein text, or something like that. I'm actually looking at the book that he co-wrote with a bunch of people, projecting his stuff that he worked on until 1914. He has this like 1914 to 1925 futures stuff that I should read, where I'm guessing they try to figure out the most likely trajectories of things. I think it's interesting because I'm not sure. So, for example, Adam Smith in Beijing by Arrighi, I don't know if holds up as well as some of Wallerstein's work, so I'm very interested in figuring it out. I'm going to
read some Arrighi soon.
Well, I think Adam Smith in Beijing is actually quite interesting, but I like it is off of the theory that like China is still semi-periphery, and I'm like, well, that's over.
Yeah,
like a lot has happened in China since the late 90s, my friend. Like, you know, and so yeah. Thanks for coming on. People check out your stuff. At the time of we're recording this, our long discussion on Christopher Lasch is probably not out, but this will probably come out after that. So hopefully the world system has not totally collapsed and we're not back into the Stone Age by the time I release this.
I mean, Varn told me I'll give you 30 minutes, and we're approaching the 2.5 hour mark. So
yeah, sorry. Well, it's better than the last time where I was like, I'll give you an hour, and it was 4 hours. All right.
That was great. That was a fun night.
Yeah, well, that was you could literally hear me get mad at Christopher Lasch like I knew him personally. But anyway, have a good night, man.
All right, have a good night.
Bye-bye.